Hi, I'm Jeff Brummett, one of the co-managers of the Libero Cautious Dynamic and Solution Funds. Along with Nick Davis, we'll be talking about what happened in March and sort of our broader outlook. All the major equity markets were down in March. The US was down significantly, making it probably the worst quarter we've seen in the US in some time. And it's this very difficult combination of Trump's, and I'll say crazy, tariff plans, and the way he's announcing them and changing them day to day, colliding with, I would say, a US equity market that was very rich. And now on top of that, you're finally seeing the impact of the DOGE, of the Department of Government Efficiency run by Elon Musk. And the whole idea behind that was to find and remove waste in government spending. But what's happening in the US is Musk and his team are, I would say, almost indiscriminately firing government employees. And not only is he firing government employees, but it's spilling over into consulting firms that support many of the agencies in the US government where employees are getting fired. So there's a growing question of, can the government still provide the services that are required by citizens? And you're seeing very sharp declines in confidence numbers. This hasn't translated yet into the hard data. We're not seeing a rise in unemployment materially yet nationwide. We've not seen a real drop-off in retail activity, but the fears are that this is growing. Trump and other officials in the government have even said it's possible we could have a recession in the US, and we are going to get announcements later today as we record this video on the severity and scale and breadth of new tariff initiatives that Trump is launching. He's labeling this Liberation Day, liberation from the tyranny of trade deficits with foreign countries. But it's really madness in terms of raising prices for most Americans on any imported goods that they purchase, and it will even raise the prices on some goods where components are made overseas. The product is assembled in the US, but it will still be subject to the tariff. So there's nothing good about this at all, and the markets are feeling and reflecting that. Thankfully, the US isn't the only place to invest, and we've had success in China, a great deal of success in Europe, and we expect that's going to continue. So Europe has really stepped up and announced close to $800 billion in new ways that defense spending can happen in Europe, 800 billion euros. Germany, not to be outdone, under the leadership of their new chancellor, has also removed what was known as the debt brake. Germany can now borrow more money and is going to engage in additional fiscal spending, not only for defense, but also for broader infrastructure measures in Europe. And this is, again, material numbers. We're talking 500 billion euros in infrastructure spending in Germany, and then significant increase in annual defense spending in Germany. So I think this new defense initiative in Europe is going to be a strong secular tailwind for Europe. It won't necessarily fully offset damage caused by tariffs, but it will make a difference. And it's made a huge difference for performance in our portfolio. And as to China, we keep learning about new developments on their AI and technology front that are very encouraging, and the government continues to be committed to stimulating consumption and activity. So I think those are two parts of the world that, although tariffs are not going to help, at least they are initiating policies that are supportive of growth. I'd have to say right now, everything Trump is doing is bad for growth in the near term. It may prove to be correct that a smaller footprint for the federal government in the US economy is ultimately a good thing, but how we get there could be very, very painful. And I think that's what the markets are trying to digest, and I think that's going to provide continued volatility over the balance, certainly of the next few months, and probably the balance of this year.
As part of the portfolios, we have obviously been very light in some of the more growth tech stocks in the US, and that defensive nature has really helped us over this last month in what has been a difficult period. The S&P 500 in sterling terms is down about 8%, and the MSCI All World Acqui Index is off about over 6.5% in sterling terms. The Nexus portfolios have been much more defensive over this period, although they have fallen around about 2% in both the Nexus Dynamic and Nexus Solutions portfolios. We still maintain some US positions, but holdings like Coca-Cola have been very defensive, and also our exposure to other areas of the world where we've increased exposure to Europe and into China. The rationales for the move into Europe we had earlier on last year when we had concerns about Donald Trump and his commitment to Europe and to NATO, but generally about a demand for an increased expenditure by European nations in terms of defence spending. We feel there's a very transactional nature to his style of government, and the trade-off he's looking for is potentially from Europe was that increased defence expenditure. We're waiting to see how that pans out. Well, it has meant we've seen greater commitment from the European Union to work together, and to that end we've increased exposure to infrastructure stocks in Europe through a holding in Vinci, which invests in things like toll roads, power stations and bridges. And again, we think this is an area we will see to continue to do well. And again, it's very defensive in terms of its nature. The defence stocks we bought last year have performed very well. We've seen some significant rises since the beginning of this year. We believe that the commitment to defence spending is not a one-off flash in the pan type event. This is now a much more sustained period of investment by European governments into this sector. The other area we have increased exposure to was China, and through Chinese technology and the holding in Libero in particular has been particularly successful for us. We think there's a greater focus on increasing domestic Chinese expenditure. There's a huge market there internally for them to deal with, and we think that is where we'll see an element of the retrenchment away from the US as tariffs come in to kick in to make Chinese goods become less competitive due to the imposition of tariffs. So despite concerns we have about US growth, we believe there may be other opportunities around the world. What we may see is effectively a dramatic change in where growth is.
I think one other point I'd like to touch on is, the role of central banks in all this. And, inflation continues to run around or slightly above target in the UK, in the US, and in the Eurozone. The Bank of England and the Fed didn't do anything. The ECB cut another 25 basis points, but suggested they were possibly finished with cuts unless there was new data developments that made them feel even better about where inflation was going. But all three central banks were unanimous in saying they were so uncertain about their outlooks and their forecasts because of the Trump tariff mania, really, and the not knowing, the lack of clarity on how long the tariffs will last, how high will they be, what goods will they be put against, and the variability of them, that they seem to change from week to week and day to day. It's making it very hard for the central banks to forecast inflation. But again, all three also agreed that they saw inflation higher on balance because of tariff impacts. So the challenge will be, if there is a slowdown in activity because of tariffs, will the central banks be able and willing to lower rates in the face of what may also be at the same time higher inflation because of the tariffs? I think if we saw certainly a recession in the US, the Fed would respond aggressively and really ignore the inflation side. If we have more of a kind of a stagflation environment, sluggish growth, maybe not negative, but maybe just barely positive, but higher inflation from the tariffs, it's hard to see the central banks moving policy materially. That may prove to be an issue over the balance of this year.